In 1982, a wall of fire is said to have torn open the Siberian night along a Soviet gas pipeline. A blast so vast it could be seen from space. The claim is that the CIA caused it by letting the KGB steal software the agency had secretly rigged to self-destruct. It may be the most audacious act of industrial sabotage in Cold War history, or a paragrapf in one man's memoir that no document has ever confirmed. To understand the fireball, you have to start with the man who handed the West the keys to the entire Soviet technology empire. The man who would eventually betray the Soviet technology machine was not, at first, a dissident. He was a true believer. Vladimir Ippolitovich Vetrov was born in 1932, entered the KGB in the 1950s, and rose through an institution that rewarded ambition with access and access with danger. In 1965, the KGB sent him west to Paris under commercial cover, tasked with penetrating French high-technology industry. Paris in the late 1960s was more than an assignment. It was a revelation of boulevards, cafes, and frank conversations Soviet society had never allowed him. There, inside the world of French electronics, Vetrov met an engineer named Jacques Prévost from the defense firm Thomson CSF. Prévost was not a target, but a friend, and that friendship showed Vetrov the gap between what the Soviet Union claimed and what the West had actually built. By 1970, the KGB recalled Vetrov to Moscow, pulling him back from the city and the life he had come to prefer. Back in Moscow, Vetrov was assigned to Directorate T, the KGB department dedicated to acquiring foreign science and technology. Directorate T was the engine behind what the KGB called Line X, the systematic looting of Western scientific and industrial secrets through officers posted inside Soviet trade missions and embassies. By the early 1980s, Vetrov held the rank of colonel, or possibly lieutenant colonel, the record is contested, with sightlines across the entire Line X network. He could read the shopping lists sent in from residencies in 10 countries, the delivery reports sent back, and the names of every officer running each operation. But something had curdled in him since Paris, a resentment at watching colleagues advance through politics while he stalled. He had sat inside the French laboratories and understood what the theft was really confessing, that the Soviet Union could not build what it was stealing. In 1980, Vetrov made contact, not with the CIA, but with French intelligence, the DST. The French gave him a code name that would title one of the Cold War's most consequential operations, Farewell. What Vetrov offered was not a single secret, but an archive, the systematic delivery of Directorate T's institutional memory, document by document. He was not acting on ideology alone. He wanted recognition, money, and to be seen as a man of consequence. Between early 1981 and early 1982, Vetrov passed approximately 4,000 documents to the French. What those documents contained would force the Reagan administration to confront the full scale of what the Soviet Union had already taken. The Farewell dossier had been built one document at a time by a disillusioned colonel who had walked the streets of Paris and never quite come home. Before a single document left Moscow, the KGB had built an entire division dedicated to one purpose: stealing what the Soviet economy could not invent. That division was called Directorate T, the T for Technica, technology, and its covert arm inside every KGB residency abroad was Line X. Line X officers did not recruit spies in the traditional sense. They ran scientific and industrial collection, targeting patents, blueprints, and prototype specifications from Western defense contractors. By the late 1970s, the Soviet military-industrial complex had grown so dependent on stolen Western technology that Line X was effectively subsidizing an entire generation of weapons programs. In a single year, Line X collected hundreds of acquisition targets: microelectronics, machine tools, computer architecture, radar, catalogued in annual shopping lists. It was not espionage as audiences imagine it. It was procurement, run with the bureaucratic appetite of a state import agency operating entirely outside the law. Vetrov, tasked with evaluating what Line X actually obtained, had a unique vantage point. He could see both the shopping list and the receipt. Beginning in the spring of 1981, Vetrov photographed those documents and delivered them to a French contact in Moscow. The French intelligence service, the DST, gave him the codename Farewell, and what he delivered became one of the most consequential intelligence hauls of the Cold War. By early 1982, French analysts had processed approximately 4,000 documents, not fragments or summaries, but original KGB materials. 4,000 documents is a filing cabinet emptied, a year's worth of operational secrets photographed one frame at a time. Buried in those pages were the identities of more than 200 Line X officers, some accounts say as many as 250, across at least 10 KGB residencies in Western capitals. The files also exposed more than 100 leads to agents the Soviets had recruited in the West. Paris alone housed a substantial Line X presence. Running collection against French aerospace and electronics firms Vetrov had himself helped coordinate. The dossier also contained leads on more than 100 Western sources, scientists, engineers, and company employees who had supplied Line X with what it came for. What made the material uniquely dangerous was the architecture it revealed, the entire decision-making structure of how the USSR chose what to steal and from whom. Analysts could now read the KGB's own internal assessments of how much stolen Western technology had accelerated Soviet military development, and those assessments were frank and alarming. One internal KGB evaluation, as later described by French officials, concluded that Line X had saved the Soviet defense sector years of indigenous research across multiple fields. The French now held not just a list of agents, but a mirror of Soviet technological vulnerability no satellite photograph could have provided. The question confronting Paris in 1981 was not whether the material was genuine, its volume and consistency made that clear, but what to do with it. Sharing the dossier with allies meant admitting France had run a source inside KGB headquarters, a disclosure that carried its own risk if the material was ever traced back. But 4,000 documents naming Line X officers across 10 residencies was not intelligence any single country could act on alone. And in July 1981, France made its decision. On July 19, 1981, the most valuable intelligence asset of the Cold War walked into a G7 summit as a secret. French President François Mitterrand had been in office less than 2 months, yet he already carried a secret that could reshape the Cold War. He had inherited from his predecessors a KGB colonel named Vladimir Vetrov, and nearly 4,000 stolen Soviet documents no American had yet seen. Mitterrand made a decision that would define the rest of the Cold War. He would share it. In a private meeting on the sidelines of the Ottawa summit, Mitterrand briefed President Ronald Reagan on the farewell dossier. Reagan, by all accounts, was stunned. A KGB officer had been handing France the entire architecture of Soviet technology theft. The material was so sensitive that it did not travel through normal CIA channels. It passed first through Vice President George Bush. From Bush, it went to CIA Director William Casey, a veteran of wartime OSS operations, who immediately grasped what he was holding. Casey's first instinct was not just to use the intelligence, it was to weaponize the pipeline that had produced it. The question forming inside the CIA was simple and ruthless. If the Soviets were stealing Western technology, what if that technology was designed to fail? The man who would answer that question was Gus Weiss, a technology policy officer on the National Security Council staff. In January 1982, Weiss delivered a proposal so audacious that even seasoned intelligence officers needed a moment to absorb it. Weiss proposed using Vetrov's own shopping lists against the Soviets, let Line X keep stealing, but seed the pipeline with sabotaged goods. The Soviets had spent years building a network to acquire the West's most advanced technology. Weiss wanted to turn that network into a delivery system for failure. According to his 1996 article in CIA Studies in Intelligence, the only authoritative account written by Weiss himself, the plan centered on flawed hardware designs and defective turbines. The beauty and the terror of the plan was its invisibility. The Soviets would acquire the technology willingly, believing they had outsmarted Western export controls. Reagan approved the operation, and a classified U.S. task force began identifying which items on the Line X shopping list could be corrupted without detection. The sabotage had to be subtle enough to evade Soviet inspection, yet catastrophic enough to matter when deployed. For the operation to work, Vetrov had to keep supplying France, and the Soviets could not suspect their most productive channel had been turned against them. By the start of 1982, the trap was set, but Vladimir Vetrov was about to destroy everything, with a single act of violence that had nothing to do with espionage. What Weiss's plan actually produced, a fireball visible from space, or merely defective turbines quietly failing in a Soviet field, remains to this day genuinely contested. The Ottawa meeting of July 19, 1981, set the trap in motion, and decades have not been enough to fully decode what happened next. In January 1982, the National Security Council economist Gus Weiss walked into CIA Director William Casey's office with an idea that would redefine the Cold War. Weiss had just spent weeks studying the farewell documents, the same stolen KGB files Mitterrand had handed Reagan at Ottawa 6 months earlier. What he saw was not just a map of Soviet espionage, it was a complete shopping list of everything Line X intended to steal next. Weiss realized the shopping list itself was a weapon. If the CIA knew what the Soviets would steal, it could choose what they received. His proposal, approved by Casey in early 1982, was precise: substitute working technology with subtly defective versions and feed them back into the Line X pipeline. The sabotage was designed to be invisible at the point of theft. The flaws would only surface later, after the technology had been installed deep inside Soviet infrastructure. Weiss coordinated with multiple Western governments and allied industries to quietly corrupt specific items on the Line X wish list: hardware designs, blueprints, software. Flawed hardware designs came first. Schematics with tolerances shifted just enough that the manufactured part would fail under operational load, not in a test lab. Corrupted blueprints came next, documents that looked authoritative but carried embedded errors in structural load calculations and material specifications. And then there were the turbines, industrial gas pipeline turbines, whose specs were quietly manipulated so the machines would degrade ahead of their design life. According to Weiss's own 1996 article in CIA Studies in Intelligence, the closest thing to an official account, flawed turbines were inserted into a supply chain headed for a Soviet gas pipeline. There is no explosion in Weiss's account, no fireball, no software, no Canadian company, only flawed turbines on a gas pipeline. That deliberate restraint in an official CIA publication is itself a document. It tells you exactly how far the agency was willing to corroborate in print as of 1996. Beyond the turbines, Weiss wrote that the broader operation introduced defective chips into Soviet military and industrial systems across multiple sectors. The strategy used Soviet secrecy against itself because Line X officers could not admit they had stolen the technology. They could not easily report that it did not work. The mechanism was self-reinforcing. The more the Soviets relied on the stolen technology, the deeper the flaws embedded themselves into their infrastructure. By 1982, the operation was active, defective components moving quietly through the same Line X pipeline that Farewell had exposed. Soviet engineers who would install these parts had no way of knowing they were unpacking exactly what their own intelligence service had procured for them. Vice would later write that the operation cost the Soviets in ways that took years to fully surface. The turbine incident, just one node in a much larger web of deliberate failure. What the 1996 article does not say, and has never said, is whether that node on the gas pipeline ever produced the catastrophic explosion Thomas Reed would describe 8 years later. In 2004, a former Reagan White House official named Thomas Reed published a memoir containing a single paragraph the intelligence community had never officially confirmed. Reed wrote that in 1982, Trojan horse software, obtained by Soviet agents from an unsuspecting Canadian company, was deliberately allowed to leave the United States and travel east. The software, Reed claimed, was designed to run Soviet pipeline pumps and turbines, and inside it, CIA technicians had buried a time bomb. According to Reed, when the software was deployed on a trans-Siberian gas pipeline, it ran normally at first, lulling Soviet engineers into confidence. Then, at a moment of the CIA's choosing, the logic shifted. Pumps surged past safe tolerances, pressure spiking beyond anything the pipeline was built to contain. Reed's exact words, "The resulting explosion was the most monumental non-nuclear explosion and fire ever seen from space." The year was 1982. The location somewhere along the thousands of miles of Soviet gas infrastructure snaking across western Siberia toward European customers. If true, it would mean the United States had secretly triggered the largest peacetime industrial explosion in history, without a shot fired or a soldier deployed. But the moment historians and journalists went looking for the explosion, the evidence began to dissolve. Gus Weiss, who designed the sabotage program in January 1982, published his own account in the agency's journal in 1996, 8 years before Reed's book appeared. Weiss described defective turbines, flawed chip designs, and corrupted factory blueprints, a broad sabotage campaign across dozens of industrial categories. But Weiss wrote nothing, not one word, about a pipeline explosion. From the KGB's own side, a retired pipeline security officer named Pechelintsev acknowledged that a pipeline explosion did occur in that era. But Pechelintsev said a Soviet government commission blamed it not on sabotage but on construction defects, pipe not bent to handle temperature swings, laid in marshy ground without proper anchoring. His account named no foreign software and no CIA, only the chronic shortcomings of Soviet industrial execution under pressure to build faster than quality allowed. The Washington Post investigated Reed's claim and found no Soviet documentation, no accident report, no inquiry, no memorial for workers who would have died in a blast that size. Historian Mark Trachtenberg, reviewing the available record, described the paper trail behind Reed's claim as woefully incomplete. Former CIA Deputy Director John McMahon, inside the agency during the entire Farewell operation, said flatly that no such pipeline sabotage operation was ever mounted. Reed, for his part, stood by every word, though his own account was second-hand, not something he had personally witnessed. No corroborating document has been declassified, and the CIA has neither confirmed nor denied that the pipeline explosion occurred. What is not disputed, the Weiss sabotage program ran, defective technology entered the Soviet industrial base, and the damage to Soviet technical capability was real and lasting. Whether a fireball ever lit the Siberian night in 1982, or whether Reed's paragraph is the only explosion that ever actually occurred, that question remains, as of today, unanswered. While Weiss's sabotaged blueprints were still moving through the Line X pipeline, the man who made all of it possible was about to destroy himself in a parked car on a Moscow street. February 1982. Vladimir Vetrov, KGB colonel and the most damaging Western mole inside Soviet intelligence, is alone in his car with his mistress when an argument turns violent. He stabbed her, and when a passerby pulled open the door to intervene, Vetrov stabbed that man too, killing him on the spot. Vetrov was arrested within minutes, not by counterintelligence that had broken his cover, but by ordinary Moscow police responding to a murder. The man who had passed 4,000 classified documents to French intelligence was taken into custody for a street crime, his espionage, for the moment, entirely undiscovered. His French handlers at the DST learned what had happened not from a surveillance report, but from a Soviet newspaper item about a murder conviction. Firewall went silent, and the most productive intelligence pipeline of the early Cold War simply stopped. In autumn 1982, a Soviet court tried Vetrov for murder and sentenced him to 12 years in a labor camp. That sentence would have buried the espionage question entirely had someone not kept looking. It was in prison that investigators, working through Vetrov's background as a precaution, began pulling on threads that should never have been left loose. What they found, the document runs, the contact patterns, the foreign travel records, reconstructed the 4,000 document pipeline piece by devastating piece. Vetrov was charged with treason, the one crime in the Soviet code that carried a mandatory death sentence, no appeal, no commutation. He confessed, not because confession could save him, but because the evidence in his file left him nothing to deny. On January 23, 1985, Vladimir Vetrov was executed. The date later recorded in the French intelligence files built on everything he handed over. The French DST only learned the date of his execution years later. His death, like his life inside the KGB, confirmed by documents rather than witnesses. But before his exposure could be contained, the intelligence he had already delivered had set events in motion that Soviet counterintelligence could not reverse. In 1983, Western governments, acting on the officer identifications buried inside the 4,000 documents, coordinated a wave of expulsions across multiple countries. Approximately 200 Soviet intelligence officers were expelled from Western countries in a single coordinated operation. Line X, the KGB's technology arm, that had run for years with near total impunity, lost officers across 10 residencies in a matter of weeks. The network that had delivered enormous amounts of Western technology to Soviet defense programs was, for practical purposes, dismantled. Layered beneath the expulsions was Weiss's second operation, sabotage technology, already absorbed into Soviet infrastructure. Its defects, running silently inside turbines and control systems, the KGB believed it had stolen clean. Whether one of those defects triggered a fireball over Siberia in 1982 is the question this story began with, and it remains, as of today, genuinely unanswered. Reed wrote it as fact in 2004. Weiss's 1996 CIA account mentioned only flawed turbines and no explosion. Pechelintsev said a blast happened but blamed construction defects, and a former CIA official said no such operation was ever mounted. What is not disputed is this: a single KGB colonel handed the West a map of Soviet intelligence's most sensitive network, and the damage that followed was among the most consequential intelligence operations the Cold War ever produced.